Madison Reed never imagined she would whisper for help to a stranger. Yet on the night of the biggest gala of her career, surrounded by investors and board members who answered to her every word, a quiet terror crept into her chest for the first time in years. She noticed the bodyguard standing beside her was not one of her own people. Something about his stance, his silence, the way his eyes tracked the exits instead of the crowd, told her the truth before her mind could fully catch up. As she passed a man working quietly near the edge of the VIP section, she leaned close and spoke only 2 words, "Help me." In the space of 3 seconds, the calm expression on Cameron Walker's face shifted into something that had been sleeping inside him for years. Was Cameron Walker about to save a powerful CEO or unknowingly step into a conspiracy that could destroy them both? At 34 years old, Madison Reed had built a reputation few executives in the technology industry could match. She ran her company with a blend of precision and instinct, the kind that made boardrooms fall silent the moment she began to speak. For nearly 2 years, she had been steering toward a merger so large it would reshape the entire industry, a deal analysts were already calling the most significant of the decade. Every clause of the contract had been negotiated personally, every detail checked and rechecked, because she trusted almost no one with something this important. The signing gala was meant to be a celebration, a public unveiling of years of relentless work, and investors from across the country had been flown in for the occasion. The company's board had assured her again and again that everything was finally in place. None of them knew how close the entire empire actually was to collapsing from within. In the weeks leading up to the gala, the company's stock had climbed in steadily, fueled by leaked rumors of the merger and a wave of confidence from Wall Street. Board members who once questioned every decision now praised her publicly, eager to be associated with what they assumed would be a historic win. Madison accepted the praise carefully, never fully trusting applause that arrived too easily. Among the loudest voices supporting her was Ryan Mercer, the company's chief financial officer, a man she had worked beside for nearly a decade. Ryan smiled in every meeting, nodded at every proposal, and offered reassurance whenever anxiety crept into the room. Behind that practiced warmth, however, he had spent months quietly building something Madison could not yet see. Every figure he presented to the board had been shaped, just slightly, to serve a purpose only he understood. It began with small inconsistencies that anyone else might have dismissed. A handful of internal documents related to the merger's financial structure went missing from the shared servers, blamed on a routine technical glitch. A set of meeting notes from a private session with overseas investors could not be located when legal counsel asked for them. Madison noticed the gaps but reasoned that any company moving at this speed would experience friction somewhere along the way. She had survived hostile takeovers before, weathered lawsuits, and outlasted 2 recessions, so a few misplaced files barely registered as a concern. What she could not yet see was the pattern forming underneath those small failures, each one a piece of a larger structure being built without her knowledge. Ryan made certain that every irregularity pointed away from himself and towards systems too complicated for anyone to question closely. 3 days before the gala, an anonymous message arrived on a private line reserved only for emergencies. The message contained no threats of violence and no demands, only a single sentence warning her to delay the signing. Madison read it twice, then deleted it, assuming it was the work of a disgruntled competitor or an activist investor trying to rattle her before the vote. She had received strange messages before, usually timed around major announcements, and none of them had ever amounted to anything real. Still, she mentioned it briefly to her head of security, who promised to look into the matter and report back within a day. No report ever came, and in the rush of final preparations, Madison let the warning slip from her mind entirely. It would not be the last time someone tried to warn her before the danger became impossible to ignore. The night of the gala arrived with the kind of polished energy reserved for milestone events, chandeliers glowing above a room filled with tailored suits and quiet ambition. Madison moved through the crowd with practiced ease, shaking hands, accepting congratulations, rehearsing the short speech she would give before the signing. Near the edge of the ballroom, she scanned her security detail out of habit, counting the familiar faces who had protected her for years. One face did not belong. He stood near the service entrance, dressed correctly, posture rigid in the right way. Yet something about his eyes felt wrong, scanning the room with a purpose that had nothing to do with protecting her. Madison's pulse quickened as she realized, for the first time that night, that the danger she had dismissed might have already arrived inside the building. Cameron Walker had taken the night shift at the hotel for nearly 3 years, and in that time he had perfected the art of becoming invisible. As night manager, he oversaw everything from staffing schedules to emergency protocols, a role that suited a man who preferred order over attention. He avoided conflict whenever possible, deflecting arguments from difficult guests with a calm voice and a practiced smile that revealed nothing underneath. Most of his coworkers assumed his quiet confidence came from years of hospitality experience, never suspecting it had been forged somewhere far more dangerous. Cameron liked it that way, because the life he had left behind was not one he wanted anyone to ask about. He had built a small, steady world for himself and his daughter, and he intended to keep it that way, no matter what walked through the lobby doors. The gala filling his hotel that evening was larger than most events the building hosted, with security teams from multiple companies moving through hallways that were usually reserved for staff. Cameron noticed details most people overlooked, a habit he had never managed to switch off completely. A van parked too long near the loading dock without unloading anything. Two men near the kitchen entrance who never touched their drinks and never stopped watching the main floor. A woman near the elevators adjusting an earpiece that did not match standard event communication gear. None of it was conclusive on its own, but together the pieces formed a shape Cameron recognized instantly, the shape of a setup designed to look like nothing at all. Madison felt the unfamiliar guard's eyes on her long before she understood why it frightened her. When she excused herself toward the restrooms near the VIP lounge, he followed at a distance just close enough to control her movement without seeming obvious. Near the corridor leading away from the main floor, another man stepped into her path, smiling the kind of smile meant to look like simple courtesy. He suggested, in a tone too firm for a stranger, that she should step outside for fresh air before her speech. Madison's instincts, sharpened by years of negotiating with people who hid intentions behind pleasant words, told her this was not an invitation she could refuse politely. As she turned to find an excuse, her eyes landed on a hotel employee standing near a service cart, someone whose calm presence felt different from everyone else around her. Without fully deciding to do it, she walked toward him and let two words slip from her lips, quiet enough that only he could hear. Cameron heard those two words the way a soldier hears a flare in the dark, a signal that bypassed thought and went straight into instinct. Years of training he had tried to bury rose to the surface in an instant, sharpening his vision, slowing his breathing, narrowing his focus onto everything around Madison Reed. He recognized the posture of the man trailing her, the kind of stillness that came from discipline rather than nerves, the mark of someone trained for far more than standing guard. In the time it took most people to finish a sentence, Cameron had already mapped 3 possible escape routes through the building. He understood, with absolute certainty, that walking away from this moment was no longer an option his conscience would allow. The life he had worked so hard to keep simple was about to collide with the one he thought he had left behind for good. He stepped toward Madison, offered a polite, practiced smile to anyone watching, and quietly told her to follow him as if she were simply being shown to another room. Within seconds, Cameron had assessed the scene with the precision of someone who had once been trained to read a room full of threats before they fully formed. He noted that the man trailing Madison kept one hand near his jacket in a position meant to look relaxed but ready. He clocked the second man blocking the corridor as muscle without finesse, someone meant to intimidate rather than execute anything delicate. The woman near the elevators adjusted her earpiece again, confirming she was relaying Madison's position to someone unseen. None of them carried themselves like hotel security or private contractors hired through legitimate channels. Their formation suggested a coordinated operation, not a simple disgruntled employee or a jealous rival trying to make a scene. Cameron understood immediately that whoever orchestrated this had resources, patience, and a plan extending far beyond a single gala night. He guided Madison through a door marked for staff only, moving with the unhurried confidence of someone who belonged exactly where he was. To anyone watching from a distance, it looked like nothing more than an employee escorting a guest who needed a quiet moment away from the noise. Inside the narrow hallway, Cameron borrowed a spare uniform jacket from a laundry cart and handed it to Madison without explanation, instructing her to put it on over her dress. She hesitated only a moment before complying, some instinct telling her that questioning him now would cost time she did not have. Cameron radioed a colleague using hotel terminology that sounded routine to anyone listening in, quietly rerouting 2 other staff members to create movement and confusion near the ballroom entrance. He never raised his voice, never reached for anything resembling a weapon, relying instead on misdirection and timing honed long before he ever wore a hotel uniform. Madison watched him work and felt something close to disbelief, as if she had stumbled into a version of safety she did not know existed inside ordinary people. They moved through service corridors lit by humming fluorescent panels, Cameron checking each turn before allowing Madison to follow. He kept a measured pace, neither rushing nor lingering, aware that panic would draw exactly the kind of attention they needed to avoid. Madison asked quietly who was doing this to her, and Cameron answered honestly that he did not yet know, though the coordination suggested someone with serious resources. She studied his face for a flicker of fear and found none, only the steady calculation of someone working through a problem methodically. By the time they reached a service elevator near the kitchen, Madison had stopped second-guessing her decision to trust him completely. Cameron pressed the call button, glanced once more down the corridor behind them, and allowed himself a small breath of relief that quickly proved premature. Back in the ballroom, the man assigned to watch Madison realized, with a cold jolt of alarm, that his target had vanished without a trace. Connor Hayes received the news through a single curt message relayed from his earpiece, and his jaw tightened at the implication behind it. A former mercenary with experience spanning multiple conflicts and private contracts most people never heard about, Connor did not tolerate failure quietly. He ordered every exit sealed immediately, instructing his team to treat the hotel as a contained perimeter rather than an open building. Within minutes, men positioned near the main entrance, the parking structure, and the loading dock began tightening their formation, watching faces with renewed intensity. Connor moved through the crowd himself, scanning for any sign of Madison Reed or the man who had apparently helped her disappear. He understood that whoever had intervened was not simply a lucky bystander, because no ordinary employee would have managed to vanish with a target this cleanly. Somewhere inside this building, an unknown variable had entered his carefully planned operation, and Connor intended to find out exactly who that variable was. Cameron led Madison through a maintenance corridor connecting the kitchen to the hotel's lower utility levels, a route few employees ever bothered to memorize. He explained, in clipped sentences, that the men hunting her had likely already locked down the main exits, which meant moving upward or outward through normal channels was no longer safe. Madison's heels echoed against the concrete floor until Cameron quietly suggested she remove them, and she did so without complaint, gripping them in one hand as they walked. Somewhere above them, muffled voices and footsteps suggested the search had intensified. Men moving with purpose through hallways meant only for staff. Cameron paused at a junction, listening carefully before choosing a direction, his expression unreadable to anyone who did not know what calculation looked like on his face. Madison realized, with a strange mixture of fear and clarity, that she trusted this stranger more in the last 10 minutes than she trusted most people she had known for years. Whatever this was, she understood now it had nothing to do with random chance, and everything to do with someone who wanted her gone before tonight ended. They reached a heavy door leading toward the building's lower mechanical level, where generators and water systems hummed steadily in the dim light. Cameron tested the handle and found it unlocked, ushering Madison through quickly before sealing it behind them as quietly as the old hinges allowed. The space smelled of metal and dust, lined with pipes and humming machinery that masked the sound of their footsteps from anyone above. Madison watched Cameron study the room with the same quiet focus he had used upstairs, clearly searching for another way out rather than simply hiding. He admitted in a low voice that this particular maintenance level had limited exits, which meant they would need to move carefully and quickly. As he scanned the far wall for a service hatch he remembered from building inspections, the muffled sound of a door opening somewhere above froze them both in place. Whoever was hunting them had found the same maintenance corridor, and the gap between safety and danger had just become dangerously small. In the dim hum of the mechanical room, Madison finally allowed herself to ask the question pressing against her chest since the moment they fled the ballroom. She wanted to know who Cameron really was, because no hotel manager moved through danger with this kind of precision. Cameron hesitated, weighing how much truth a stranger deserved, then offered her a version stripped down to its essentials. He told her he had once served in a specialized federal unit, the kind that rarely appeared in any official record available to the public. A mission years earlier had gone wrong in ways that cost him people he considered closer than family, and the weight of that failure had driven him out of that life entirely. Since then, he had built something quiet and ordinary, a world built around stability rather than danger, mostly for the sake of his daughter. Madison listened without interrupting, recognizing in his voice the particular exhaustion of someone who had given everything to a cause that ultimately broke him. Madison studied him in the half-light, struck by how different his honesty felt compared to the careful performances she encountered daily in boardrooms. Every man she had ever worked with seemed to want something from her, whether admiration, advancement, or simple proximity to power. Cameron wanted none of that, and the realization settled over her with unexpected weight. She found herself speaking more freely than she had in years, admitting how isolating it felt to run a company where loyalty often masked ambition. Cameron listened carefully, occasionally glancing toward the door, never losing awareness of their surroundings even as the conversation deepened. He told her gently that the kind of fear she described, fear of who to trust, was a feeling he understood better than most people ever would. As their conversation wound down, Cameron's mind kept circling back to one unsettling detail buried in everything Madison had shared about the company's recent troubles. He asked her, carefully, who had access to the merger documents that had mysteriously disappeared in the weeks before tonight. Madison listed the names without hesitation: lawyers, board members, a small circle of executives including her trusted chief financial officer. Cameron's expression shifted slightly, the way it did when a piece of a puzzle clicked into place faster than expected. He explained that the operation hunting her tonight required planning, funding, and inside knowledge of her schedule that no outsider could easily obtain. Someone close to her, someone with detailed access to her movements and her company's inner workings, had likely been feeding information to whoever orchestrated this attack. Madison's face paled as she began running through the people she trusted most, searching for any signs she might have missed. Somewhere inside her own organization, a betrayal had been quietly taking shape long before tonight's danger ever reached her. Ryan Mercer had spent 10 years building an image of unwavering loyalty, the kind of reputation that made betrayal almost unthinkable to anyone who knew him casually. Behind closed doors, however, he had grown resentful of watching Madison receive credit for successes he believed were built on his financial strategies. The merger that promised to define her legacy also threatened to dilute his influence permanently, restructuring power in ways that left him increasingly irrelevant. Quietly, over many months, Ryan had cultivated a relationship with Connor Hayes, a man whose particular skills made certain problems disappear without leaving obvious fingerprints. Together they designed a plan meant to remove Madison from the equation just long enough to manipulate the merger vote in Ryan's favor. Falsified documents, carefully prepared months in advance, would paint Madison as reckless and unstable, justifying an emergency transfer of authority to the board's most senior remaining executive. Every piece had been arranged with the patience of a man who believed he had outsmarted everyone around him. The plan relied heavily on timing, since the merger vote scheduled for the following week left little room for delay or suspicion. Ryan had already begun quietly courting select board members, framing his concerns about Madison's leadership as reluctant honesty rather than calculated maneuvering. He suggested subtly that recent operational glitches and missing documents pointed toward instability at the highest level of the company. Several board members, eager to protect their investments, had already begun entertaining the idea that change might be necessary before the merger closed. Ryan understood that perception mattered more than truth in moments like this, and he had spent years mastering the art of shaping perception. Connor's role was simple in comparison: remove Madison from public view long enough for the narrative to solidify without her interference. Neither man anticipated that the very person meant to disappear quietly would instead find an ally capable of dismantling their entire plan from the shadows. Back in the mechanical room, Cameron pieced together enough fragments from Madison's account to understand the shape of the danger they faced. He recognized patterns common to corporate sabotage operations he had encountered briefly during certain federal assignments years earlier. Falsified records, manufactured instability, a convenient absence at exactly the right moment, all pointed toward someone orchestrating a quiet coup rather than a simple robbery or random threat. Madison listened as Cameron laid out his theory, feeling a mixture of dread and clarity settle over her at once. She admitted that Ryan had seemed unusually supportive lately, a realization that now felt less like comfort and more like warning signs she had chosen to ignore. Cameron warned her that confronting Ryan directly without proof would only accelerate whatever plan was already in motion. Their priority now had to shift from simply escaping toward gathering evidence strong enough to expose the truth before the vote took place. Cameron guided Madison toward a service hatch leading to an alley behind the hotel, away from the men still searching the main floors above. They moved quickly through narrow passageways meant for deliveries, Cameron checking corners with the discipline of someone trained never to assume safety. Outside, the night air felt sharp against Madison's skin, a stark contrast to the controlled warmth of the ballroom she had left behind. Cameron flagged down a rideshare vehicle parked nearby, choosing it deliberately over calling Madison's usual driver, whose loyalty could no longer be assumed. As they slipped into the back seat, Cameron instructed the driver toward a destination several blocks from where they actually intended to go, a small precaution against anyone tracking their movement. Madison watched the hotel disappear behind them, aware that the danger she once dismissed as an annoying message had become something far more real. Somewhere behind them, Connor Hayes was already receiving updates confirming his targets had slipped past the perimeter entirely. Connor's frustration sharpened into focus as reports confirmed Madison Reed had left the building through a route his team had not anticipated. He pulled up traffic camera access through a contact embedded in city infrastructure, scanning footage for any vehicle matching descriptions near the hotel's rear exit. Within minutes, his team identified the rideshare vehicle and began tracking its movement through downtown streets with practiced efficiency. Cameron, anticipating exactly this kind of pursuit, instructed the driver to exit early, paying generously for the inconvenience without explanation. He led Madison on foot through a parking garage, weaving between vehicles before emerging on a different street entirely, breaking the visual trail Connor's team depended on. Madison struggled to keep pace, unfamiliar with movement designed purely around evasion rather than convenience, yet she refused to slow him down. Cameron's calm, methodical pace told her this was not improvisation, but a skill set built through repetition over years she could only imagine. They ducked into a quiet diner near the edge of downtown, chosen deliberately for its multiple exits and lack of obvious security cameras inside. Cameron seated Madison facing the door while he kept his own back to the wall, watching the street through reflections in the window glass. He explained quietly that predictable patterns were the easiest way to get caught, which meant their next moves needed to avoid anything resembling routine. Madison admired how naturally precaution seemed to come to him, every choice deliberate, every risk weighed before action. Outside, a dark sedan slowed briefly near the diner entrance before continuing past, and Cameron's eyes followed it until it disappeared around the corner. He admitted that whoever organized tonight's pursuit had resources extending beyond typical security contractors, hinting at deeper financial backing than a simple corporate dispute usually justified. Madison realized, with growing unease, that surviving the night required more than simply running, it required uncovering exactly who wanted her gone and why. Cameron excused himself briefly to make a call from a payphone 2 blocks away, unwilling to risk using a traceable device for what came next. He reached out to a former teammate named Derek Holt, someone who had transitioned from federal service into private cybersecurity work after their unit disbanded. Derek answered cautiously, surprised to hear Cameron's voice after years of silence, and even more surprised by what Cameron asked of him. Cameron requested a discreet trace on financial transactions connected to a private contractor he suspected was operating under multiple shell identities. Derek agreed without hesitation, recognizing the urgency in Cameron's voice despite his friend's usual composure. Within an hour, Derek sent encrypted files revealing a pattern of payments routed through offshore accounts, eventually connecting back to a corporate account tied loosely to Madison's own company. The trail, though incomplete, pointed unmistakably towards someone with deep access to both financial systems and operational decisions inside Madison's organization. Madison reviewed the documents Cameron shared with growing disbelief, recognizing internal account structures she had personally approved years earlier. The payments, disguised as consulting fees and vendor contracts, had been quietly diverted toward accounts linked to private security operations rather than legitimate business services. She traced the approval chain backward, her stomach tightening as the signatures repeatedly led toward Ryan Mercer's office. Cameron watched her process the betrayal in real time. The particular kind of grief that came from realizing someone trusted for years had been working against you in silence. He reminded her gently that evidence alone, without proper legal context, might not be enough to convince a skeptical board already primed against her. Madison straightened, pushing past the initial shock toward the calculating focus that had built her career in the first place. They needed more than financial records. They needed proof strong enough to dismantle Ryan's credibility entirely before the merger vote sealed his victory. As the night deepened, Connor adjusted his strategy, recognizing that a direct chase through public streets risked drawing unwanted attention from law enforcement. He redirected his team toward known associates and patterns connected to Madison's personal life, hoping to predict where she might seek shelter. A tracking device hidden inside Madison's own phone, planted weeks earlier during a routine maintenance visit arranged by Ryan, finally pinged a location near the diner. Connor's men converged quickly, moving with the practiced silence of professionals rather than the obvious aggression of street criminals. Cameron noticed the shift in atmosphere outside the diner before Madison did, instinct flagging movement that did not belong to ordinary pedestrian traffic. He guided her calmly toward the kitchen exit, instructing the staff inside with a tone authoritative enough to avoid questions. By the time Connor's team breached the front entrance, their targets had already vanished into the maze of alleys behind the building. The chase that followed pushed Cameron's old instincts fully back into motion, every movement calculated with the precision of someone who had once trained for exactly this kind of pursuit. He led Madison through narrow passageways, doubling back twice to confuse anyone attempting to track their path visually. At one point, two of Connor's men nearly intercepted them near a loading dock, only narrowly avoided when Cameron pulled Madison behind a stack of delivery crates seconds before they passed. Madison's heart pounded violently, yet she found herself trusting his timing completely, recognizing that panic would only slow them both down. Cameron's breathing remained steady throughout, his focus entirely on reading the environment several steps ahead of where they currently stood. They eventually reached an underground parking structure, where Cameron located an older vehicle he recognized as belonging to a maintenance worker he had once helped during his time at the hotel. Without hesitation, he convinced the man to lend them the car temporarily, offering enough cash to ease any hesitation about the unusual request. Connor, increasingly aware that his team continued losing ground against an opponent who moved with unexpected discipline, requested additional support from Ryan directly. Ryan, growing anxious as the night stretched longer than planned, pressed Connor for results, reminding him how little time remained before the merger vote. Connor assured him the situation remained contained, though privately he began questioning whether the man helping Madison Reed was simply lucky or something far more dangerous. He pulled facial recognition data from hotel security footage recovered earlier in the night, running it through private databases his organization maintained for situations exactly like this. The search returned a heavily redacted file, most details blacked out except for a name buried deep within old federal records. Cameron Walker. Connor stared at the screen for a long moment, recognizing immediately that this was not a man who had simply stumbled into Madison's path by accident. Cameron drove carefully through quieter streets, avoiding main roads where traffic cameras and patrol patterns made movement predictable. Madison sat beside him in silence for several minutes, processing everything that had unfolded since the moment she whispered those two words at the gala. She finally asked whether he regretted helping her, given how dramatically it had disrupted whatever quiet life he had built for himself. Cameron considered the question honestly before answering that some things mattered more than comfort, and watching someone get hurt by people she trusted was one of them. Madison studied his profile in the dim light from passing street lamps, recognizing the particular weight carried by someone who measured his choices against past failures he could never undo. She realized, with quiet certainty, that whatever Cameron had lost in his previous life had shaped him into exactly the kind of person capable of saving hers tonight. Their next move, they both understood, required exposing Ryan's betrayal before the board convened for the final vote. With Derek's continued help, Cameron began assembling a clearer picture of how deeply Ryan's scheme reached into the company's operations. Hidden communications recovered from a secondary server revealed months of correspondence between Ryan and Connor, carefully worded to avoid explicit incrimination yet unmistakable in its intent. Madison recognized several phrases referencing removing obstacles before the vote, language disturbingly casual given what she now understood it meant. Cameron cross-referenced financial records with boardroom attendance logs, confirming Ryan's private meetings with select board members had increased significantly in recent weeks. Each piece of evidence reinforced the same conclusion, a coordinated effort to destabilize Madison's leadership just long enough to seize control during a moment of perceived crisis. Madison felt a strange mixture of anger and resolve solidify inside her, replacing the fear that had dominated the earlier hours of the night. They were close to enough proof to expose everything, but Connor's renewed pursuit meant time was no longer a luxury either of them could afford. Connor, now certain of exactly who he was dealing with, shifted tactics entirely, recognizing that conventional pursuit would not work against someone with Cameron's background. He pulled together his most experienced operatives, choosing quality over numbers, understanding that brute force alone would not corner a man trained to avoid exactly that kind of confrontation. Surveillance drones, quietly deployed over key intersections near downtown, began scanning for the borrowed vehicle Cameron had taken from the parking structure. Within the hour, one drone operator flagged a match, triggering Connor to mobilize his team toward an industrial district on the outskirts of the city. Cameron, sensing the shift in pursuit intensity, recognized the telltale signs of professional tracking rather than random searching. He warned Madison that whoever hunted them had clearly identified him specifically, which meant the danger had escalated beyond a simple corporate dispute. Whatever happened next, Cameron understood, would likely require confronting Connor directly rather than continuing to evade him indefinitely. Cameron chose an abandoned warehouse complex on the edge of the industrial district, familiar terrain from earlier years spent training in similarly isolated environments. He positioned Madison inside a reinforced office structure near the back of the building, instructing her firmly to remain hidden no matter what she heard outside. Madison protested briefly, wanting to help, but Cameron explained calmly that her safety depended entirely on staying out of the confrontation that was about to unfold. He moved through the warehouse methodically, using shadows and structural cover to control the terrain before Connor's team ever arrived. When the first vehicles pulled into the lot outside, Cameron had already memorized every exit, every blind spot, every advantage the building's layout offered him. Connor emerged from his vehicle with the calm confidence of a man accustomed to controlling outcomes through force, unaware of how thoroughly Cameron had already shaped the battlefield around him. What followed was less a fight than a careful dismantling of Connor's plan, piece by piece, exactly as Cameron intended. The confrontation unfolded with brutal efficiency, Cameron neutralizing two of Connor's men before they fully understood what was happening around them. He used the warehouse's structure against them, narrow corridors limiting their numbers' advantage, low visibility disrupting their coordination entirely. Connor, recognizing quickly that his men were being systematically removed from the equation, attempted to flee deeper into the building rather than continue a fight he sensed slipping away from him. Cameron pursued with deliberate patience, never rushing, understanding that desperation often led opponents into mistakes far more damaging than any direct attack could achieve. He eventually cornered Connor near a loading bay, disarming him through a controlled sequence of movements honed across years of training Connor could never hope to match. Madison, watching cautiously from a distance despite Cameron's instructions, witnessed firsthand the cost behind the calm exterior he presented to the world. As authorities arrived to take Connor into custody following an anonymous tip Cameron arranged earlier that night, Madison understood that the danger to her life had finally ended, though the danger to her company had not. With Connor secured and unable to continue serving Ryan's interests, Madison felt a temporary wave of relief mixed with renewed urgency. Ryan remained free, unaware that his enforcer had been captured, still believing his plan to seize control during tomorrow's vote remained fully intact. Cameron warned Madison that confronting Ryan prematurely without presenting evidence publicly would only give him room to maneuver or destroy remaining proof. They spent the remaining hours before dawn organizing everything Derek had uncovered into a clear, undeniable narrative ready for presentation. Madison contacted her legal team quietly, instructing them to prepare emergency documentation without revealing the full scope of what had transpired overnight. Cameron remained close throughout, not out of obligation, but because he recognized this fight was not yet finished and refused to abandon it halfway. By morning, exhausted but resolute, Madison Reed prepared to walk into the most important boardroom meeting of her career, carrying proof capable of ending Ryan Mercer's ambitions entirely. The boardroom filled quickly that morning, members arriving with the cautious optimism of people expecting a transition of power rather than its dramatic unraveling. Ryan stood near the head of the table, composed and confident, believing Madison's absence the previous night confirmed exactly the instability he had spent months suggesting to the board. He opened the meeting smoothly, framing recent operational disruptions as evidence that leadership changes were necessary before finalizing the merger. Several board members nodded along, swayed by weeks of careful manipulation disguised as concern for the company's stability. Just as Ryan began outlining a proposal to transfer emergency authority into his own hands, the boardroom doors opened unexpectedly. Madison walked in calmly, dressed sharply despite the exhaustion lingering beneath her composed expression, every eye in the room turning toward her immediately. Behind her, Cameron entered quietly, carrying a folder containing everything needed to dismantle the narrative Ryan had spent so long constructing. Ryan's confident expression faltered slightly as Madison took her place at the head of the table, addressing the room with steady authority. She acknowledged the rumors circulating about her supposed instability, then calmly explained the real events of the previous night without revealing unnecessary detail about Cameron's background. Cameron stepped forward at her request, presenting financial records, communication logs, and verified documentation tracing the conspiracy direct back to Ryan and his arrangement with Connor Hayes. The room fell into stunned silence as evidence unfolded methodically, each document reinforcing the undeniable pattern of sabotage orchestrated from within the company itself. Ryan attempted to interject, dismissing the claims as fabricated, but his composure cracked further with each new piece of proof presented before the board. Several board members who had previously supported him now exchanged uneasy glances, recognizing how thoroughly they had been manipulated over recent weeks. By the time Madison finished speaking, the room's sympathy had shifted entirely, leaving Ryan isolated among colleagues who no longer trusted a single word he said. As Madison concluded her presentation, two uniformed officers entered the boardroom, having been contacted earlier that morning once sufficient evidence justified formal action. Ryan rose quickly, attempting to argue his innocence, insisting the documents had been manipulated to frame him unfairly. His protests grew increasingly desperate as officers approached, the weight of his exposed betrayal finally breaking through the composed mask he had maintained for years. Board members watched in stunned silence as the man they once considered indispensable was escorted from the very room where he had attempted his final maneuver for control. Madison remained still throughout, feeling no satisfaction in his downfall, only quiet relief that the truth had finally surfaced before real damage occurred. Cameron stood slightly behind her, watching the scene unfold with the same calm detachment he carried into every dangerous situation, though something in his expression suggested genuine relief as well. With Ryan removed and the conspiracy fully exposed, the board unanimously agreed to proceed with the merger under Madison's continued leadership, restoring the stability the company desperately needed. In the days following Ryan's arrest, the story of an attempted corporate takeover spread quickly through financial circles, drawing significant attention from journalists eager to understand exactly what had transpired. Details about Cameron's involvement emerged gradually, prompting reporters to seek interviews and public statements about the man credited with protecting Madison Reed. Cameron declined every request firmly but politely, uninterested in recognition that would inevitably draw unwanted attention back into his quiet life. He returned to his usual responsibilities at the hotel, resuming night shifts as though nothing extraordinary had interrupted his routine just days earlier. His daughter noticed his renewed lightness without understanding the reason behind it, simply grateful her father seemed less burdened than she remembered him being in recent months. Madison, meanwhile, used the public attention to reinforce trust in her company's stability, careful never to expose Cameron's identity beyond what he had agreed to share. The merger closed successfully within the week, securing both her legacy and the company's future exactly as she had originally intended. Several weeks later, once the chaos surrounding the merger finally settled, Madison found herself standing outside the same hotel where everything had begun. She had debated reaching out sooner, uncertain whether gratitude alone justified intruding further into Cameron's carefully guarded privacy. When she finally approached the front desk, Cameron looked up from his paperwork, recognizing her immediately despite the noticeably calmer circumstances surrounding this visit. Neither spoke for a moment, the silence carrying weight neither needed to fill with unnecessary words. Madison thanked him simply, acknowledging that her company and likely her life remained intact because a stranger chose to listen when she whispered for help. Cameron accepted her gratitude without deflecting it, something he rarely allowed himself to do, recognizing that this particular moment deserved honesty rather than modesty. Standing there, two people shaped by very different forms of loss found themselves quietly understanding something neither had expected to feel again. Madison asked, carefully, whether Cameron ever considered building a different kind of life beyond the quiet routine he had constructed for himself. She did not frame it as a question about romance or obligation, simply curiosity about whether stability had become a cage rather than a refuge. Cameron considered the question longer than expected, weighing years of deliberate avoidance against the unfamiliar sense of possibility stirring inside him since the night they met. He admitted that the version of himself who once refused every opportunity to reconnect with anything beyond survival felt different now, less certain that distance was the only way to stay safe. Madison smiled gently, recognizing in his hesitation the same caution she carried after years of guarding herself against people who only valued her position. Neither needed grand declarations or dramatic promises, only the quiet acknowledgement that two people who understood loss might also understand how to begin again. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Cameron did not retreat from the possibility standing in front of him, and when Madison asked if he was finally ready to start over, he simply smiled and did not say no.